In the spring of 1999, the city of Grand Junction, Colorado, was shaken by a case that refused to make sense. It did not begin with a dramatic chase or a public confrontation. Instead, it started with a disappearance that quietly unsettled an ordinary community. A 39-year-old woman failed to return home, and within a matter of days, concern turned into a criminal investigation. 5 days after she was reported missing, investigators discovered her body near the Colorado River. The medical examination confirmed what everyone feared. She had been the victim of homicide. The news spread quickly throughout the city. Families followed every update, hoping the police would identify the person responsible before another tragedy could occur. Detectives immediately began interviewing neighbors, friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have crossed paths with the victim during the days leading up to her disappearance. Every possible lead was documented. Every known relationship was examined. Every timeline was carefully reconstructed. Despite those efforts, the investigation struggled almost from the beginning. There were no reliable eyewitnesses who could identify a suspect. The physical evidence collected from the scene revealed very little that investigators could use to build a case. The victim's final movements remained incomplete, leaving detectives with more questions than answers. Weeks turned into months, and every promising lead gradually collapsed under closer examination. While law enforcement continued searching for answers, another story was unfolding quietly hundreds of miles away. A man named Ethan Mercer made the decision to leave Colorado. To everyone around him, the move appeared completely ordinary. Americans relocate every day for work, family, or a fresh start, and Ethan's departure attracted no attention. No detective viewed him as a person of interest. His name never appeared in investigative reports connected to the homicide. He had never been questioned about the victim, and no evidence linked him to the crime scene. Without raising any suspicion, Ethan settled in Tennessee. His new life looked remarkably ordinary. He found stable employment, paid his bills on time, rented a modest home, and blended into the routines of everyday American life. His neighbors considered him polite. His co-workers described him as dependable. Local authorities had no reason to remember his name because he rarely appeared in any official records beyond routine paperwork. Years passed without incident. Unlike many people who eventually attract police attention through unrelated offenses, Ethan avoided every situation that might place him under scrutiny. He never accumulated a criminal record in Tennessee. He never became involved in public disputes that required law enforcement intervention. Even minor violations that often bring ordinary citizens into contact with police seemed absent from his life. Each passing year strengthened his confidence. Back in Colorado, the homicide investigation slowly lost momentum. Detectives refused to forget the victim, but practical reality forced difficult decisions. New cases demanded immediate attention. Limited investigative resources had to be shared among countless active files. Eventually, Ethan's victim became another name in the growing collection of unsolved homicide cases stored inside police archives. The file remained open. The hope never completely disappeared. Every detective understood that cold cases sometimes came back to life decades later through new witnesses, improved forensic science, or unexpected confessions. Until then, however, there was simply nothing left to pursue. For Ethan, that silence became part of daily life. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. Then 15. With every anniversary that passed, the distance between his present and the events of 1999 seemed greater than ever. The people around him knew nothing about Colorado. They knew nothing about the woman whose life had ended before the turn of the century. They knew nothing about an investigation that had quietly faded from public attention long ago. His entire future had been built upon one belief. He believed the past had disappeared forever. He convinced himself that time had erased every connection between his current identity and the secret he carried. As modern America changed around him, technology advanced, businesses evolved, and communities grew. Ethan assumed the homicide had become just another forgotten tragedy buried inside aging evidence boxes and outdated police databases. He could not have imagined that the greatest threat to his freedom would never come from detectives reviewing old files. It would not come from new DNA evidence. It would not come from an eyewitness suddenly remembering an overlooked detail. It would not come from someone recognizing his face after nearly 2 decades. Instead, the first crack in the carefully constructed wall separating Ethan from his past would emerge from something so ordinary that millions of Americans encountered it every week without giving it a second thought. A routine automated notification. A simple customer database. A national retail chain whose daily prescription reminders reached thousands of phones across the country. At that moment, Ethan knew nothing about the mistake that was quietly approaching his life. The homicide investigators in Colorado knew nothing either. Neither side realized that after 17 years of silence, the case was already moving toward a turning point. No new investigation had been launched. No hidden witness had stepped forward. No detective had uncovered forgotten evidence. The countdown had already begun, and the first sign of it was about to arrive in the most unexpected way imaginable. For 17 years, Ethan Mercer lived in Tennessee as though Colorado belonged to another lifetime. The murder in Grand Junction had faded from newspapers, from local television updates, and from everyday conversation. The victim's name remained inside police records, but outside of those files, the world had moved on. New families had moved into old neighborhoods. Businesses had changed ownership. Technology had reshaped the way people worked, shopped, paid bills, and remembered their own lives. Yet Ethan continued moving through his days with the quiet discipline of a man determined never to attract attention. His life in Tennessee was built around routine. He worked steadily, kept his personal history simple, and allowed people to know only enough about him to consider him ordinary. In a culture where neighbors often measured trust by reliability, politeness, and the absence of trouble, Ethan fit in easily. He was not the type of man anyone discussed with suspicion. He was not known for drama. He was not connected to police calls, lawsuits, unpaid debts, or public disturbances. To the people who saw him in grocery lines, parking lots, pharmacies, and break rooms, he was simply another middle-aged American trying to get through the week. That ordinary image protected him more effectively than any false identity ever could. No one in Tennessee had reason to link him to an unsolved homicide in Colorado. No one in Colorado had reason to search for him in Tennessee. The original case had gone cold because investigators had lacked evidence, not because they had overlooked a known suspect. Ethan's name was absent from the list of people questioned. It was absent from the list of possible leads. It was absent from the story entirely. Year after year, that absence became his shield. By 2016, 17 years had passed since the killing near the Colorado River. Ethan had crossed from one chapter of life into another. The man who had left Colorado after the crime was now older, more settled, and more confident that the past had lost its power. He had watched the country change around him. Cell phones became central to daily life. Automated systems replaced human reminders. Pharmacies sent text alerts instead of making personal calls. Retail chains built massive customer databases that connected phone numbers, prescriptions, addresses, rewards accounts, and advertising lists. For most Americans, those systems were convenient. A message from a pharmacy meant a prescription was ready. A voicemail from a store meant a routine pickup. A coupon in the mail meant another promotion competing for attention. These were small interruptions of modern life, the kind people deleted, ignored, or forgot within seconds. For Ethan, one of those ordinary interruptions would become the beginning of the end. In early 2016, his phone began receiving text messages from a local Walmart pharmacy. At first, there was nothing dramatic about them. The messages were automated, brief, and practical. They stated that a prescription was ready for pickup. The name attached to the alerts was Claire Dawson. Ethan did not know anyone named Claire Dawson. The first message seemed like a simple mistake. Wrong numbers happened all the time. Someone could have typed one digit incorrectly on a pharmacy form. A customer could have changed phone numbers without updating an account. A store employee could have entered outdated information into the system. Ethan had no immediate reason to believe the message meant anything more than that. so he ignored it. But the messages did not stop. Another alert arrived with the same name. Then another. Each one carried the same routine purpose. A prescription was waiting, and Claire Dawson needed to pick it up. The repetition transformed the mistake into something harder to dismiss. Ethan was not being contacted once by accident. His phone number had somehow become attached to a woman he did not know, through a system tied to medicine, identity, and personal records. In an ordinary life, that might have been annoying. In Ethan's life, it became dangerous. The name stayed with him because it did not belong anywhere in his world. Claire Dawson was not a coworker, not a neighbor, not a family friend, not someone he had dated, not someone he had seen on a bill or a piece of mail. She was a stranger, yet her name kept arriving through his phone with the calm certainty of a system that believed it had reached the right person. At first, Ethan tried to treat it as nothing. He told himself that mistakes happened in large retail chains every day. Walmart served millions of people. Pharmacies handled countless prescriptions. Automated alerts went out constantly. A wrong number was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was not connected to anything hidden in his past. But each new message made that explanation weaker in his mind. The alerts arrived with no awareness of what they were doing to him. They were not emotional. They were not accusatory. They did not mention Colorado, the river, the year 1999, or the woman whose death had remained unsolved. They did not contain any detail that should have mattered. Still, the repetition began pressing against the part of Ethan that had never been free. He had spent 17 years believing that silence meant safety. Now, a phone in Tennessee was delivering a stranger's name again and again, and the silence around him no longer felt complete. The more he thought about the messages, the more impossible it became to let them pass. He wanted to understand why that name was appearing in his life. He wanted to know whether Claire Dawson was real. He wanted to know why Walmart believed she could be reached through him. That curiosity did not come from innocence. It came from fear, because Ethan carried one truth no one else around him knew. He had once killed a woman whose name he had never known. That missing detail had followed him for years, buried beneath routines and distance. He had left Colorado without ever learning who she truly was, and because of that, any unfamiliar female name tied to death, medicine, or hidden records had the power to reopen the place in his mind he had tried to seal shut. The Walmart messages continued. The name continued. Claire Dawson remained unknown to him, yet impossible to ignore. By then, what had begun as a harmless pharmacy mistake had already crossed into something much darker inside Ethan's thoughts. The outside world saw nothing unusual. A retail system had sent text alerts to the wrong phone. A customer database had likely made an ordinary error. No investigator had called him. No detective had reopened the case. No official accusation had been made. But Ethan no longer experienced it as ordinary. For the first time in 17 years, something from outside his control had entered the quiet life he had built in Tennessee. It had arrived through the most common channel of modern American convenience, an automated text message from a Walmart pharmacy. And because he had spent nearly 2 decades hiding from a crime no one knew he had committed, he could not receive that mistake like a normal man. He received it like a warning. Curiosity became the first thing Ethan could not control. The Walmart messages had begun as an inconvenience, the kind of wrong number mistake that should have ended with a deleted notification and a brief complaint to customer service. But the name Claire Dawson stayed in his mind long after the screen went dark. It did not belong to his daily life. It had no place in his work records, his bills, his neighborhood, or the few personal contacts he allowed around him. Yet it kept arriving with the impersonal confidence of a system that believed it had reached the right man. For a while, Ethan tried to let reason win. In modern America, phone numbers moved from one person to another. Pharmacies stored outdated information. Retail databases made errors. Automated reminders did not understand fear, guilt, or coincidence. They simply delivered what they were programmed to deliver. Prescription was ready. Claire Dawson needed to pick it up. That was all the message said. But Ethan was not an ordinary recipient. The crime in Grand Junction had one detail that had never left him. He did not know the victim's name. He had left Colorado carrying that absence like a locked room inside his memory. The woman had been real, her death had been real, the investigation had been real, but her identity had remained distant from him. Over the years, that missing name had become part of the way he survived. If he did not know who she was, then in the darkest corner of his thinking, he could keep her from becoming fully human in his present life. Now a woman's name was being pushed into that silence. Claire Dawson. The more Ethan saw it, the more the name began to feel less like a mistake and more like an answer. He told himself he only needed to know whether she existed. He only needed to confirm that the message had nothing to do with him. He only needed a small piece of information, enough to quiet the pressure that was building beneath his ordinary routine. So he searched for her online. It was a normal thing to do in the world he now lived in. Americans searched unfamiliar names every day for countless reasons. A missed call, a strange email, an old classmate, a potential scam, a name on a bill that did not belong to them. In another life, Ethan might have typed the name into a search bar and moved on after finding nothing meaningful. But this was not another life. The results unsettled him immediately. There appeared to be information connected to a woman named Claire Dawson who had died years earlier. The details were not enough to prove anything with certainty, but Ethan did not need certainty. Fear filled in what facts did not provide. His mind connected the Walmart alerts to the old homicide, the unknown woman in Colorado, and the one truth he had hidden from everyone around him for 17 years. In that moment, the mistake stopped being a mistake to him. He began to wonder whether Claire Dawson was the name of the woman he had killed. The possibility changed everything. Until then, the messages had been annoying and strange. After the search, they became personal. Each alert felt like it carried knowledge no machine should have had. Each mention of the prescription seemed to reach beyond customer records and into the part of his past he had believed was beyond discovery. Ethan never replied to the messages. He did not contact Walmart to correct the number. He did not ask the pharmacy who Claire Dawson was. He did not want to put his own name into the same conversation as hers. The safest choice, he believed, was silence. Silence had protected him for 17 years. Silence had allowed him to leave Colorado, build a life in Tennessee, and remain invisible to law enforcement. But silence no longer gave him peace. The alerts continued to come. Prescription was ready. Claire Dawson was expected. The wording stayed ordinary, but Ethan no longer read it in an ordinary way. He began to imagine hidden intention behind automation. He wondered if someone had linked his phone number deliberately. He wondered if an investigator had found something and chosen to frighten him before making an arrest. He wondered if a person from the past had somehow learned what he had done and was using the pharmacy system to reach him without saying anything directly. There was no evidence for any of it. That did not matter. Paranoia did not need evidence. It only needed guilt, repetition, and a name that arrived too many times to feel harmless. For 17 years, Ethan had lived by controlling what people knew about him. He kept conversations simple. He kept his history vague. He avoided trouble because trouble created records, and records created attention. But now attention seemed to be finding him without his permission. It came through an American retail system so common that no one else would have feared it. It came through a pharmacy reminder meant for someone else. It came through the name of a woman he did not know, yet could not separate from the woman he had killed. By the time the messages kept repeating, Ethan had already crossed a line inside his own mind. He no longer saw Claire Dawson as a stranger attached to a clerical error. He saw her as a possible ghost from Grand Junction, a name rising out of a case that had been silent since 1999. And once that belief took hold, every new notification became another warning. The text messages should have been the end of it, or at least the point where a reasonable person corrected the mistake and moved on. Ethan could have called the Walmart pharmacy, explained that Claire Dawson was not connected to his number, and asked them to remove him from their system. He could have blocked the alerts. He could have treated the whole thing as one more inconvenience of modern life, no different from spam calls, misdirected emails, or automated reminders meant for a previous customer. But Ethan was no longer thinking like a reasonable person. The name had already reached the place in his mind where guilt had been stored for 17 years. Once he connected Claire Dawson to the woman in Grand Junction, every ordinary explanation began to sound too simple. A wrong number no longer felt like a wrong number. A pharmacy reminder no longer felt like a pharmacy reminder. The system was doing exactly what automated systems did every day across America, but Ethan had begun hearing accusation in its repetition. Then the calls started. They came as voicemail notifications connected to the same Walmart pharmacy system. The message was just as plain as the texts had been. Prescription was ready. Claire Dawson needed to pick it up. The information was routine, almost empty of emotion, delivered in the language of convenience that surrounded American retail pharmacies. Nothing in the message mentioned Ethan. Nothing mentioned Colorado. Nothing mentioned murder. Nothing suggested that any human being was behind it. That was what made it worse for him. If a detective had called, Ethan could have understood the threat. If a stranger had left a direct warning, he could have measured it. If someone had accused him by name, the danger would have been clear. But these messages were cold, repetitive, and indirect. They offered no face, no explanation, and no point of contact that felt safe. The more neutral they were, the more Ethan imagined a hidden purpose beneath them. His life in Tennessee began to narrow around that name. At work, he remained the same quiet man people thought they knew. He kept his schedule. He fulfilled his responsibilities. He avoided anything that would invite concern or questions. But beneath that ordinary surface, the Walmart alerts were changing the way he understood his world. The phone was no longer only a phone. It had become a line connecting him to a past he believed had been sealed. Each new notification suggested that someone, somewhere, had placed him inside a system designed to remind him of what he had done. He returned again and again to the same thought. Claire Dawson might be the victim. He had never known the woman's name in 1999. That missing fact now became the center of his fear. If Claire Dawson was the woman from Grand Junction, then the alerts were not random. They were a signal. Someone knew he had killed her. Someone knew he had escaped. Someone was using a common American pharmacy chain to say what they did not want to say directly. The logic was irrational, but to Ethan it began to feel airtight. The text messages had arrived first. Then the voicemails followed. The same company, the same name, the same instruction repeated over and over. In his mind, coincidence had limits. He believed the pattern had become too precise to ignore. He still did not respond. Responding felt dangerous. Calling Walmart might create a record. Asking about Claire Dawson might attach his voice, his name, or his number more firmly to hers. If someone truly was watching, then any attempt to investigate through official channels could confirm that he had noticed. Silence seemed safer, but silence also left him trapped inside his own conclusions. The fear began feeding itself. He considered the possibility that the police had reopened the old case. He imagined that investigators had discovered something after all these years and were testing him before making an arrest. He wondered whether a person connected to the victim had found him online, matched his phone number to his location, and arranged the messages as a way to break him down. He thought about enemies he did not know he had, people who might want revenge, people who might want money, people who might want him dead before the truth ever reached a courtroom. There was still no proof. The only real facts were simple. A Walmart system had sent prescription alerts to the wrong phone. A name Ethan did not recognize had appeared repeatedly. A voicemail system had continued the same mistake. But guilt turned those facts into a story, and Ethan believed the story because it came from the only witness he could never escape, himself. 17 years of freedom had not erased the crime. It had only hidden it under routine. He had mistaken the absence of punishment for safety. He had mistaken the quietness of ordinary life for forgiveness. Now a retail pharmacy system, without knowing anything about him, had exposed the weakness in the life he had built. It showed him that the past did not need a detective to return. It only needed the right name, the wrong number, and enough repetition to make a guilty man listen. By then, Ethan was no longer waiting for the messages to stop. He was waiting for whatever he believed would come next. Then the mail arrived. it should have meant nothing. In America, retail mailers filled homes every week. Pharmacy coupons, seasonal discounts, grocery promotions, credit card offers, insurance flyers, and advertisements printed for people who never asked for them. Most of it was ignored before it was even read. For millions of households, a Walmart advertisement was not a message. It was background noise, one more piece of commercial routine in a country built around constant reminders to buy, refill, save, upgrade, and return. But Ethan Mercer no longer lived inside ordinary meaning. By the time the Walmart mailer reached his address, the text messages had already altered his sense of reality. The voicemails had deepened it. Claire Dawson's name had become fixed in his mind as the possible identity of the woman he had killed in Grand Junction in 1999. Nothing had proven that connection, but proof was no longer the foundation of his fear. Repetition had replaced proof. Coincidence had started to feel like design. The mailer became the third sign. First, Walmart had reached his phone through text messages. Then Walmart had reached him through voicemail. Now Walmart had reached him through his home address. To an innocent customer, those were common marketing channels from a giant retail company. To Ethan, they looked like a pattern closing around him. The company name mattered because it kept returning from different directions. It was not one random alert anymore. It was not one mistaken number. It was a system that seemed to know where he was, how to contact him, and how to place the same pressure into different parts of his life. Ethan began to believe that the messages were not only about Claire Dawson. They were about him. The fear sharpened into a theory. Someone knew. Someone had connected him to the old murder. Someone had learned that he had left Colorado and built a quiet life in Tennessee. Someone had found his phone number, his address, and the one hidden weakness in his past. He had never known the victim's name. The stranger did not need to accuse him directly. The stranger only needed to keep sending signals until Ethan understood that the secret was no longer secret. That belief grew quickly because it fit the guilt he had carried for 17 years. He had always known the past was not truly gone. It had simply remained silent. Now, silence had been replaced by reminders from a company so common that no one else would question them. That was what made the fear feel impossible to explain to anyone. If Ethan told another person that Walmart was connected to an old homicide, he would sound unstable. If he stayed silent, the pressure continued alone. So he stayed silent. He did not report the mail. He did not complain to the store. He did not ask why his address had been included in the advertising list. The ordinary path that any innocent person might take felt unsafe to him. Contacting Walmart might leave a record. Asking questions might reveal that he was frightened by something that should not frighten him. In his mind, every attempt to clarify the mistake might bring him closer to exposure. The possibilities became darker. He wondered whether a private investigator had been hired by someone connected to the victim. He wondered whether a person from Colorado had traced him across state lines. He wondered whether law enforcement was watching him from a distance, waiting to see whether the alerts would break him. At times, the fear went even further. He began to think someone might want to harm him before the truth reached the courts. The idea of being hunted settled into the same space where the name Claire Dawson had taken hold. Nothing around him had actually changed. No officers had questioned him. No legal papers had arrived. No one from Grand Junction had contacted him. His name had not appeared in the news. The cold case had not publicly returned. Life around him continued according to the same American routines. Work schedules, bills, store receipts, pharmacy reminders, neighborhood conversations, and quiet assumptions that everyone was exactly who they claimed to be. But Ethan's inner world had split away from that routine. Each ordinary detail now carried a second meaning. A phone alert was no longer a phone alert. A voicemail was no longer a voicemail. A piece of retail advertising was no longer advertising. It was all part of the same imagined pressure campaign. The more he tried to reason through it, the more convinced he became that no mistake could repeat itself in so many forms unless someone had arranged it. His fear became self-confirming. If the messages stopped, he believed it might mean the next step was coming. If the messages continued, he believed the warning was intensifying. If nothing happened, he believed someone was waiting. Every possible outcome led back to the same conclusion. The old murder had found him. For years, Ethan had depended on distance. Colorado was far away. The investigation was old. The victim was unnamed in his private memory. Tennessee had become the place where he could be average, forgettable, and free. But the Walmart mailer destroyed the comfort of distance. It made him believe that his past had crossed the country and entered the everyday systems of his present life. By then, the fear was no longer something he could manage by ignoring a phone. It had become the center of his thinking. And once Ethan convinced himself that someone was deliberately reaching him, he began searching for a way to make it stop. The fear did not end after the mailer. It grew into something Ethan Mercer could no longer contain inside ordinary explanations. For months, he had tried to survive the Walmart messages by doing what had protected him for years. Saying nothing, asking nothing, and creating no record that could lead back to him. But the silence that once kept him safe now felt like a trap. Every message he ignored seemed to wait for the next one. Every unanswered voicemail seemed to leave a mark. Every piece of advertising connected to Walmart seemed to confirm that the pressure was not going away. By June 2016, Ethan had reached a point where the life he had built in Tennessee no longer felt separate from the murder in Grand Junction. The distance between the two states had collapsed inside his mind. The 17 years that once made him feel secure now seemed fragile, as if one wrong step could erase all of them at once. He had spent almost 2 decades believing that freedom meant avoiding attention. Now he believed attention had already found him. The name Claire Dawson remained at the center of everything. He had convinced himself that she was the woman he killed in 1999. He had no proof, and deep down, some part of him may have known that. But guilt had a way of turning uncertainty into certainty. The more he repeated the name in his thoughts, the more it seemed to belong to the victim. The more Walmart's automated system contacted him, the more he believed someone had arranged it to remind him that the dead still had a name, and that the name had finally reached him. The pressure became unbearable because it gave him no clear enemy. If police were behind it, they had not contacted him directly. If someone connected to the victim was behind it, they had not made a demand. If it was a threat, it had no terms. If it was a warning, it gave no deadline. The whole thing existed in a space that made Ethan feel surrounded without knowing by whom. That uncertainty pushed him toward the only place where the fear might finally end. A police station. To an innocent man, walking into law enforcement to report a strange series of pharmacy alerts would have been simple. To Ethan, it meant entering the one world he had avoided since Colorado. It meant placing himself in front of people trained to listen for inconsistencies, check old records, and turn statements into evidence. Yet his fear of staying silent had become greater than his fear of speaking. So, in June 2016, Ethan made the decision that would destroy the freedom he had protected for 17 years. He went to a police station in Tennessee and began telling officers that he had committed a murder many years earlier. There was no long investigation leading to that moment. No detective had cornered him. No warrant had been prepared. No cold case unit had tracked him across the country. Ethan brought the case to them himself, driven by the belief that the strange messages had already exposed him. The first officers who heard him had to determine whether his statement was real, confused, exaggerated, or connected to an actual crime. People sometimes walked into police stations with claims that did not match reality. Some confessed to crimes they had not committed. Some carried delusions, guilt from unrelated events, or stories shaped by fear. But Ethan's claim was specific enough to require immediate attention. He said the crime had happened in Grand Junction, Colorado, in 1999. That detail changed the situation. The Tennessee officers could not resolve the matter on their own. They needed to know whether an unsolved homicide from that time and place actually existed. They contacted authorities in Colorado and asked them to compare Ethan's statement with old case records. The request reached investigators connected to the cold case that had sat unresolved for 17 years. The answer came back with weight. There had been a homicide in Grand Junction in 1999. A 39-year-old woman had disappeared. 5 days later, her body had been found near the Colorado River. The investigation had gone cold because there had been little evidence and no known suspect strong enough to move the case forward. Ethan's story matched too closely to ignore. The case that had seemed frozen for nearly 2 decades was suddenly alive again. Not because of a new forensic breakthrough, not because of a witness, and not because police had discovered Ethan on their own. It was alive because the man who had escaped suspicion had walked into a station and placed himself inside it. Investigators began treating his words as more than a disturbed confession. They needed details. They needed a timeline. They needed to know whether Ethan could describe facts that had never been made public or facts that only the killer would know. The old case file was no longer just a record of failure. It had become the map against which every part of Ethan's statement would be tested. For the first time since 1999, the victim's case had a living suspect. And Ethan Mercer, the man who had remained invisible for 17 years, had made himself impossible to ignore. Once Ethan Mercer's first confession connected to the old Grand Junction homicide, the situation changed from a strange walk-in statement to a serious criminal investigation. Detectives could not rely on fear alone. They needed facts, and they needed those facts to line up with a case that had been sitting unresolved since 1999. A guilty man could still be mistaken about details. A frightened man could exaggerate. A disturbed man could attach himself to a case he had only read about. Every word Ethan gave them had to be tested against the record. So investigators questioned him again. This time, the focus was not simply whether he had committed a murder. The focus was what he knew. They needed to understand how he claimed to have met the woman, how the encounter had moved from an ordinary night into violence, and whether his account contained information that belonged only to someone involved in the crime. The old file from Colorado became more than paperwork. It became the standard by which Ethan's story would either collapse or become evidence. Ethan began filling in the missing pieces. He said he had met the woman on the night of the crime. He did not describe her as someone from his close circle. He did not claim a long relationship, a history of conflict, or a planned attack. The encounter, as he presented it, had begun in a way that could happen in any American city where strangers crossed paths, made brief decisions, and stepped into situations that later became impossible to undo. He said he brought her back to where he was living at the time. That detail mattered because the original investigation had struggled to reconstruct the victim's final movements. In 1999, without today's constant digital tracking, fewer phones captured locations, fewer transactions left immediate electronic trails, and fewer ordinary moments became searchable records. A person could disappear from one place and appear in another without leaving behind the kind of data that modern investigators often depend on. Ethan's statement offered a direct route where the old case had contained uncertainty. Then he described the argument. According to Ethan, the situation turned hostile after they were alone. He said he wanted her to leave. The conflict escalated. In his version, there had been no elaborate plan and no long-standing motive. It was a sudden eruption, one that became violent and ended with a woman dead. Whether that explanation softened the truth or revealed it, investigators had to listen for consistency, not emotion. The most important detail remained the same. He said he had not known her name. That statement matched the fear that had brought him into the police station in the first place. For 17 years, Ethan had carried the crime without knowing the identity of the woman in the way her family, friends, and investigators knew her. She had been a victim in a police file, a person mourned by others, but in Ethan's private memory she remained nameless. That absence had created the opening for Claire Dawson to take root in his mind. He told investigators about the Walmart messages. He explained that he had been receiving prescription alerts meant for Claire Dawson. He described the repeated texts, the voicemails, and the way the name had kept returning through Walmart's system. He also told them why it had frightened him so much. He believed Claire Dawson was the woman he had killed in Grand Junction. To investigators, that part of the confession was both revealing and bizarre. The messages had no clear connection to the homicide. Walmart had not been part of the old investigation. A pharmacy alert in Tennessee did not logically prove anything about a murder in Colorado. But Ethan's belief explained why he had broken after 17 years of silence. He had not been exposed by evidence. He had been undone by the meaning he attached to a mistaken name. Detectives continued comparing his account to the 1999 case. The more he spoke, the harder it became to dismiss him. His story corresponded with the unsolved homicide closely enough to make him a viable suspect. He placed himself in the right city, the right period, and the right circumstances. He gave a narrative that connected an unknown encounter to the victim's death. Most importantly, he voluntarily inserted himself into a case that police had not connected to him before. But then came the moment that overturned the belief driving his confession. Investigators had to explain what their checks had shown. Claire Dawson was not the victim from Grand Junction. The woman whose death had gone unsolved for 17 years had another identity, another life, another family, and another place in the record. The name that had terrified Ethan did not belong to her. The foundation of his fear cracked instantly. Everything he had interpreted as a warning had rested on one assumption: that Walmart had somehow sent him the name of the woman he killed. But that assumption was wrong. Claire Dawson was not the dead woman from Colorado. The messages that had destroyed his peace were not connected to the victim. They were not a hidden accusation. They were not a signal from the past. For Ethan, the revelation came too late. He had already confessed. The truth behind Claire Dawson was almost painfully ordinary. Investigators checked what Ethan Mercer had believed, and the answer did not support the story he had built in his mind. Claire Dawson was not the woman from Grand Junction. She was not tied to the 1999 homicide. She had no meaningful connection to the victim, the old case file, the Colorado River, or the years Ethan had spent hiding in Tennessee. The Walmart messages that had shattered his control were not part of an investigation, not part of a threat, and not part of a carefully designed plan to expose him. They were a mistake. Somewhere inside a retail pharmacy system, a phone number had been entered, stored, recycled, or connected incorrectly. An automated reminder had gone to the wrong person. Then the system had done what systems do. It repeated the same alert. It sent follow-up messages. It generated voicemails. It connected marketing and pharmacy communication in the casual, impersonal way large American companies often do. No human being at Walmart had looked into Ethan's past. No hidden hand had selected him. No investigator had used a prescription reminder to force a confession. The machine had not known anything. Ethan had known everything. That was the part he could no longer escape. The alerts had frightened him only because they had landed inside a life built on concealment. To anyone else, they might have been annoying, inconvenient, even frustrating. To Ethan, they became proof of exposure because guilt supplied the meaning the messages did not contain. The name Claire Dawson did not accuse him. His own memory did. By the time investigators explained the mistake, it no longer mattered. Ethan's confession had already reopened the homicide. His words had already placed him at the center of the case. The old file from Grand Junction was no longer cold in the same way. The victim, who had waited in the records for 17 years, finally had a path toward justice. Police arrested Ethan. The legal process moved forward with the weight of years behind it. For the victim's family and the community that had once feared an unknown killer, the arrest did not undo the loss. It did not return the woman who had disappeared in 1999. It did not erase the frustration of an investigation that had gone quiet for so long. But it did bring something that had seemed impossible for almost 2 decades. An answer. Ethan eventually pleaded guilty. In court, the strange path that led to his arrest could not erase the seriousness of what he had done. The Walmart messages were unusual, but they were not the crime. The real crime had happened in Grand Junction, when a woman's life ended and the person responsible walked away. 17 years of quiet living in Tennessee did not make that night smaller. A clean record afterward did not cancel the life taken before it. Being polite, dependable, and invisible did not turn guilt into innocence. The sentence was 10 years in prison. For a man who had lived freely for 17 years, the number carried a bitter irony. He had escaped the investigation when evidence was scarce. He had left the state without suspicion. He had built an ordinary life in a culture that often trusts people who appear stable, quiet, and law-abiding. For nearly 2 decades, he had proven how easily a person can hide behind routine. Then, after all that time, he lost everything because of a message that had nothing to do with his crime. The case became unsettling not because technology solved it, but because technology accidentally disturbed the person who had avoided justice. There was no brilliant digital breakthrough. No cold case algorithm pointed to him. No DNA match suddenly appeared. No detective found him by tracing a clue across state lines. The turning point came from a wrong number pharmacy notification, an automated voicemail, a piece of retail advertising, and the fear of a man who knew exactly what he had done. In the end, the past did not return because someone outside Ethan remembered it perfectly. It returned because he did. For 17 years, he had mistaken silence for escape. He had believed that if no one asked the right question, the truth could remain buried. But a buried truth does not become harmless simply because the world stops speaking about it. It waits inside the person who carries it. It changes the way ordinary things are heard. It turns a wrong number into a warning, a name into a threat, and a simple reminder into the sound of judgment. The woman in Grand Junction had been more than a case file, more than a date, more than an unsolved homicide stored away until new information appeared. She had been a person whose life mattered, whose absence left pain behind, and whose story deserved more than silence. The delayed confession did not restore what was taken from her, but it proved that even after many years, truth can still find a way into the open, not always through perfect justice, not always through careful investigation, sometimes through the fragile conscience of the person who ran from it. Ethan's story leaves behind a difficult lesson. A human life cannot be erased by distance, time, or a quiet reputation. The harm we cause others does not disappear simply because no one catches us immediately. In a society that often measures people by what can be seen on the outside, this case reminds us that the deepest truth may live where no record can reach. Accountability may arrive late, and justice may feel incomplete, but every hidden wrong continues to demand an answer. And perhaps the most human message is this: peace cannot be built on what we refuse to face. Real freedom begins only when truth is no longer feared. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. This story reminds us that the truth may be delayed, but it does not disappear. A person can run from the law, move to another place, build a new life, and appear ordinary to everyone around them, but the weight of the past can still remain inside. Sometimes justice does not arrive in the way people expect. It may not come through dramatic evidence or a sudden witness. It may come through fear, conscience, and the simple fact that what is hidden can never bring real peace. The lesson from this story is that every life matters, and every choice leaves a mark. Silence may protect someone for a while, but it cannot heal the harm that was caused. True freedom is not found in escaping responsibility, but in facing the truth before it destroys everything from within. If this story moved you, made you think, or left you with something meaningful, we would be very grateful for your support. To support our channel, all you need to do is press like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing more emotional, meaningful, and thought-provoking stories to this community. Thank you again for listening, for caring, and for being here with us until the end.